Hi, welcome back. We were talking about imperialism in Africa in part one. We're going to continue on here with part two. And really, what we established the first go around is some of the goods that the Europeans would have wanted in Africa. I'd mentioned gold and silver and salt and sugar and diamonds. But we also talked about David Livingstone's story because that's sort of the spark. That's what sort of gets Europeans, especially the Belgians, to come into Africa and start exploiting the people, mistreating them, and trying to take their resources. In that case, it was rubber. This go around, we're going to talk a little bit more about how other countries get involved in imperialistic pursuits of Africa. We'll talk a little bit of a clash over South Africa, and we'll finish by looking at the positive and negative effects of imperialism in Africa. So let's go on here. So all of this is sort of predicated with something called social Darwinism. Now you have to understand that most of the European countries had a lot of national pride. National pride led to the desire for more colonies. And this was that idea of mercantilism that we talked about a couple of units ago. That is, the more wealth you had, the more power you had. Well, in order to get wealth, you had to have colonies that could produce it. Colonies that had gold or silver or tobacco or whatever you could make money off of. So that's why a lot of these European countries started setting up colonies all over the globe so that they could make more money and really increase their national pride. So Europeans viewed an empire as a measure of national greatness. And there again, the bigger land you had, or the more land you had, the more money you had, the more powerful you really were. So simply put, the Europeans believed they were better than other peoples. And that's racism. You know, we've got guns, we're white, we're Christian. That's the attitude that the Europeans took. So they felt that they were justified in going into Africa and treating the Africans any way they wanted to. The Africans weren't necessarily Christian. They didn't all have guns. They lived a little bit more of a primitive way of life, and so that was easy justification for the Europeans to treat them like they were inferior, and that is really the definition of racism. Now, this all brings us to something called social Darwinism, which is based on Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest. Basically, the survival of the fittest suggests that, you know, the best species will survive. If you think about out in the wild, if you have a weak lion and a strong lion, the strong lion's likely going to survive. They'll be able to find food and survive. Well, this all became a reflection of, you know, how to treat people and how people should treat each other. So the European attitudes were a reflection of a social theory known as social Darwinism, where essentially they believed those who were the fittest for survival enjoyed wealth and success and were considered superior to others. So they use this as justification to say we're better than the Africans. We should survive. We've got more technology. We're more advanced people. Therefore, we can take whatever they have because it's survival of the fittest. And that's just really unfortunate because I would certainly hope in the modern world here, we don't believe in this today. We try to help people and we try to treat them with compassion, but unfortunately history doesn't write itself that way. Now, we also must mention that this whole colonization push also came from missionaries looking to spread Christianity. We mentioned that in the first part of the video. There's no doubt missionaries wanted to convert people to Christianity, so we have to make sure that we know that that's a part of this as well. And many of them did that very peacefully. That wasn't always done forcefully, although there are some cases where that did happen. Railroads, the Maxim gun and quinine for malaria helped Europeans push into Africa. Europeans were able to build railroads, which were allowing them to get more materials in and out of the interior of Africa. The Maxim gun is essentially like a machine gun, so you can imagine using that against uprisings of African tribes who wanted to fight you. Sadly, you could mow them down very easily. And then quinine helped you stave off malaria, which definitely allowed for a lot of Europeans to not die of disease as they pushed further in the continent. So these innovations were not available 100 years prior to this. You're talking in the 19th century or 1800s, you have access to these now, but you didn't before. So that's part of the reason why people didn't push into Africa prior to this century. So here's a map. I'm going to show you a couple of these maps on 1890. You'll notice you'll have a lot of different African tribes here. Now, just prior to 1890, the Europeans are going to meet in something called the Berlin Conference, and they're going to carve up Africa. So kind of take a mental shot of this picture, because Africa is going to look very, very different shortly after this. Yes, we've got some British, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Ottoman influence in Africa, but look, it's fairly small. But that is going to change. Because I argue that the Berlin Conference is one of those historical events that should have never happened. People should not treat other people this way, or they shouldn't think of other people in this way. So let me tell you what the Berlin Conference was all about. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 in South Africa increased European interest in colonization. There's no doubt diamonds and gold can make you a lot of money. And if you think you can get a hold of some of those diamonds and gold, you're going to try to get as much of it as you can. Remember, the rules were different back then. You could take guns and you could take this stuff if you wanted to. Obviously, it took a low-standing moral conscience to do so, but the Europeans are going to try to get their hands on as much of this gold and diamonds as they can. But the Europeans said, well, we can't all go in there. Because if all of us countries go in there, we're going to have some type of big world war. So to prevent war, 14 European nations met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 to lay down rules for the division of Africa. Think about this clearly. 14 European countries met in Germany, which is where Berlin is, to decide how they were going to divide up Africa. They didn't do this in Africa, nor did they invite African leaders to have a say in this. They met in Europe to decide how can we divide up Africa. They agreed that any European nation could claim African land by notifying other nations and showing that they could control that land. So as long as you brought in some troops, brought in some infrastructure, and you could control it, the land was yours, at least according to the Europeans. Very little thought was given to how the African groups would react, and of course, no African ruler was invited. So this is, in a sense, it's racism. I mean, it's treating the Africans as if they don't matter. It's treating them as if they don't have a say. And so in the end, the Europeans were basically saying, we're going to cover up Africa, and we don't give any care as to what the people there are going to say to this. This should have never happened. This would not be allowed to happen today. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free of European control. It's not a lot of territory. The Europeans pretty much took over everything. It's a picture of the Berlin Conference. Obviously, it's a drawing, but if you look carefully, there's no African rulers there. And then this political cartoon looked like Europeans kind of over a witch's pot. It's called the Imperial Witches, kind of giving us another point of view here, suggesting that something evil is going on here. And I would agree that this was pretty evil. So now, we had talked about this map. You see a lot of these countries or territories being ruled by African tribes. That's what these yellow areas are. They're non-European regimes. But watch what happens here. This is by 1914, so this is about 20 years after the Berlin Conference. Every one of these areas represents a European country. French is green, British is pink, German is yellow, Italian is orange, etc., etc., etc. This is Africa now completely controlled by Europeans. Again, they didn't ask the Africans, say, hey, do you mind if we take your land? Do you mind if we take your diamonds? Do you mind if we take your gold? They just moved in there and they took it. Again, they had superior technology with the railroad, the Maxim gun, and quinine. There wasn't a lot that the Africans could do. I'm going to skip that slide just for time's sake. Now, in South Africa, there's a little bit of a clash, because there's a group of people in South Africa called the Zulus that had control. So the Zulus under leader Shaka, or also known as Shaka Zulu, fought very bravely against the British. The British tried to move in there and the Zulus didn't want it. The Zulus almost win, but the Zulu nation fell to the British in 1887. Very rarely do you actually say somebody almost won in history, but the Zulus came pretty close here, especially against the superior British numbers and superior British technology. Now, what this leads to, though, is a clash between Europeans, because the Dutch settlers, known as Boers, settled the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. That predates this by over 200 years. The Cape of Good Hope is basically the tip of Africa. So you've got the Dutch here, but now you've got the British who are claiming this land as well. The Dutch fought the British when the British took over. And basically say, hey, this is our land. The British said, no, this is our land. And this was known as the Boer War, which was between the British and the Dutch Boers. So you have two European countries fighting over one African territory. Britain finally won and created the Union of South Africa in 1910. So the result here is the British takeover. You can see that this is the Dutch landing here in the 1650s, the Dutch creating a small Dutch community there. Here we've got Shaka Zulu. He comes very close to defeating the British, but he does not succeed. Again, spears and shields are going to be no competition for Maxim guns and rifles that the British are going to bring with them. Some pictures of the Boer War. Here's the Boers. This would be the Dutch on this side, and this is the British on this side. Kind of fun little fact here. He actually had Winston Churchill, who was a correspondent for the British, war correspondent. He would later become the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the time of World War II. Diamond mines, you can see, we said this kind of was all started by the introduction of diamonds into South Africa. So you can see there's a lot of diamond mines there, so there's a lot of money to be made there in South Africa. All right, let's talk about the legacy of colonial rule. We're going to start with the negative effects. It's going to be very similar to what we had talked about previously with India. There's no doubt Africans lost control of their lands and they lost their independence. So Europeans moved in, the Europeans took over politically, they took over socially, they took over economically. And that's going to mean the Africans have very little control of their own lands and their own property. Many died of smallpox as Europeans brought in diseases. You're not going to have as many that die of smallpox as it happened in the Americas, but there are going to be some significant deaths due to smallpox. Thousands died resisting European rule. When you talk about fighting against the Maxim gun and European armies, there's not much these African armies could do. I mean, they were smaller, they were less experienced, and they did not have the technology to fight the Europeans. Of course, a lot of traditional culture is going to break down. You're bringing in Christianity, you're bringing in European culture, you're bringing in European languages, you're bringing in European politics. A lot of that is going to destroy and completely eradicate a lot of the African culture. You go to a lot of these African cities today, and they resemble European cities because they basically had to in order to survive. And still in the modern world, they've had to do so. What's interesting here is when the Europeans moved in, they created the boundaries. So a lot of those boundaries or division that they created combined African groups or unnaturally divided groups that were never combined or divided before. So you might have tribes that are split apart. You might have warring tribes that are put together that combined because of the European borders that were instituted. So this is really going to cause tension later on once the Europeans leave. Of course, probably the most obvious negative effect is valuable goods such as gold, salt, and diamonds were taken out of the continent, as well as the profit that was made. The Africans were not able to benefit from their resources. The Europeans came in, took those resources, and took the profit that went with them. But here's the deal. Just like we said with India, just because a lot of negative things happened, we kind of have to make sure historically we understand that there were some good things that the Europeans instituted. But again, these are far heavily outweighed by the negative effects. For example, just like we said in India, the Europeans reduced local warfare. They were in control, they had the weapons. You didn't have tribes fighting each other anymore. And the Europeans really didn't fight each other much other than the Boer War. Sanitation was provided, so you in a lot of cases you had running water or plumbing and things like that. Hospitals and schools were built, so you had better health care and more literacy. More people could read and write because of the European rule. Lifespans and literacy rates increased. And that's, again, connection to the hospitals and schools built, but yet people living longer lives because they had access to medicine and healthcare that they didn't have before. And of course, Europeans are going to bring their technology. And again, this parallels India almost exactly. The Europeans built railroads for all sorts of reasons, moving materials, moving people, moving resources, dams for flood control and for electricity. Telephone and telegraph wires were built. And of course, all of these were initially built to benefit the Europeans, but eventually the Africans would benefit from these things as well. Okay, let's wrap up by taking another look at our constructive response question for today's lecture. The question says, describe what the European motivations for colonizing Africa were. Most of this is economic. Of course, we can go back to our Age of Exploration unit and talk about God, glory, and gold, because those three things still fuel what the Europeans wanted to do. They wanted to make money, they wanted to spread Christianity, and certainly they wanted to become famous or make a name for themselves. So God, glory, and gold is the motivation, but specifically here in Africa, there was rubber. Certainly Belgium was one that profited off the rubber business in the Congo. We have diamonds in Africa. There's gold, and salt was also a big commodity as well. But we have to also mention the Berlin Conference, because one of the motivations that is like a secondary motivation that comes out of imperialism in Africa is the fact that these European countries don't want to go to war against each other over Africa. So the Berlin Conference was set up to carve up Africa to avoid Europeans going to war against each other. And at no point in time did they consult the Africans or invite tribal leaders or leaders in Africa that could voice their opinion and either help or certainly dissuade the Europeans from carving up Africa. So the Europeans used the Berlin Conference to help themselves and certainly not help the Africans. So I think we have to mention that as a motivation as well. So that should do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.